The story begins in late 1944, when Allied armies had driven the Wehrmacht from France, and German leaders faced a collapsing front. Hitler and his staff planned a gamble, an offensive through the dense Ardennes forest that would split the Allied line and reach the port of Antwerp. The aim was to disrupt supply lines, to cut off and encircle Allied forces, and to force a negotiated peace. The Germans knew their manpower and fuel were scarce, and they hoped shock and secrecy, amplified by poor weather, could make up for that shortage. On December 16, 1944, columns of men and tanks moved under low cloud and driving snow. For a time, the weather was a shield. Allied reconnaissance planes could not fly, fighter sweeps were grounded, and radio transmissions carried through thin, icy air but did not promise immediate response. The Germans advanced with initial success. Their surprise was real. For American troops in the Ardennes, the attack felt sudden, personal, and confusing. But the winter did not simply create fog and poor visibility. It soaked into the teeth of American logistics. Men rotated forward, who had trained in the sun. The U.S. Army had been wildly successful through the fall, because fuel had flowed, because mechanized columns could cross beaten ground, and because air support could be expected to appear on short notice. None of those assumptions held under the Ardennes winter. Roads slicked with ice or clogged with snow turned supply columns into long, vulnerable snakes. Trucks spun on frozen ruts, tanks bogged in torn-up ground, hardened by cold into obstacles that could not be pushed through without great effort. Lubricants thickened, batteries lost charge faster in thin air, and radios suffered condensation and freezing. Weapons jammed when water condensed and froze in actions and bolts. Ammunition, carefully tendered in warm dumps behind the lines, could be left on cold asphalt and become hard to use. The men were often out in the open without access to hot food or hot drinks for days at a time. Thermoses froze, canned coffee sat cold. Under those conditions, the enemy that killed and wounded without a rifle began to reap harvests of its own. Cold injuries multiplied. Frostbite and hypothermia are not poetic terms. They are medical realities, with clear progression and grim outcomes. A pair of frozen fingers is not immediately obvious to a man who must carry his rifle and help a neighbor drag a stuck jeep. At first he may only feel numbness. As hours pass, white, waxy patches appear on skin. Tissue can die without immediate treatment. Men lost toes and fingers to frostbite. Some lost hands after gangrene set in. Hypothermia, the slow shutting down of the body's functions when core temperature drops, is quieter. It makes a man slow. It makes his decisions slower. It clouds judgment. In a battlefield where quick decisions decide survival, a slow mind is a fatal weakness. Many men develop trench foot and immersion foot from prolonged exposure to wet feet, combined with cold, and these troubles were not limited to frontline troops. Drivers, cooks, clerks, carriers, medics, anyone who stood in the cold for long hours without relief, suffered. Medical evacuation became a nightmare. Roads, blocked by wreckage and ice, turned ambulances into sitting targets or failed transport. When aircraft finally flew, they could bring supplies and a few badly needed actions, but the storm clouds in the early days of the offensive kept the skies dark. That grounding of air support was a two-edged sword. It helped the Germans achieve surprise. It also deprived the Allies of the ability to medevac casualties quickly. Men succumbing to shock, to exposure, to wounds that might have been survivable, with rapid treatment, died on the snow while stretcher squads strained under a canopy of white. Those deaths add up. They do not show up neatly in counts of killed in action by bullets and shells. They show up in casualty lists as non-battle injuries, as non-battle injuries, as non-battle injuries, as pneumonia, as exposure, as cold-related death. When historians count losses, they must look at the whole picture. Equipment modern to the U.S. soldier was robust, but not designed for the sudden and exhausting demands of an Ardennes winter offensive. Temperatures that drop below freezing change the physical properties of materials. Rubber becomes brittle, metal contracts and changes tolerances. Engines that turn easily on warmer days may refuse to start when the oil thickens like molasses. Men had to improvise. They used stove oil to thin lubricants. They kept engines running to save men from sitting in vehicles to avoid freezing, but that made those vehicles visible and vulnerable. Men burned ration cans for heat in shell craters, risking gas and smoke to get warm. They tried to share sleeping bags, to trade warm socks, to trade positions. These are human acts that show the scale of a problem. The U.S. Army learned quickly, but new doctrine cannot unfreeze a hand. The siege of Bastogne is the most condensed illustration of how weather and cold changed the character of the battle. The town sits at a crossroads, and the Americans there were surrounded. For days, supplies could not get through. Men in the 101st Airborne and Rifle Divisions held out while the cold became a second enemy. The defense was a testament to stubbornness, to the refusal to give up crossroads, and to the ability to hold command against a storm of both men and weather. Major General Anthony McAuliffe, when given the German demand to surrender, produced an answer that would enter legend. His one-word reply to the letter that demanded surrender was a blunt refusal, a simple American refusal. That moment, and the stand at Bastogne more broadly, shows how morale and clear leadership matter. When weather beats on men like a hammer, men there ate their socks, in the sense that they burned them for warmth and ate whatever food they could. They wrapped themselves in what little insulation they had, and they refused to break. Outside Bastogne, across the Ardennes, the map of the battle was a patchwork of small fights, of armored thrusts blocked by snow, of infantry grinding through forests where trees hung heavy with ice. The German offensive, planned for speed and surprise, slowed under the fir trees. When snow-packed, it could be both a covering cloak and a trap. Vehicles left tracks that became guides for following columns. Convoys that got off route could become stuck in gullies, and then be immobilized for days. Fuel shortages plagued the Germans on the offensive too, yet the cold had equal opportunity to punish both sides. The tempo of war slowed to a slog, and in a slog the number of men suffering from weather-related problems climbs. It is incorrect to imagine that bullets and artillery were the only killers. The muscle of battle required not only ammunition, but warmth, food, and the ability to get the wounded into proper care. Soldiers who survived shelling and fire sometimes fell ill and died because they could not stay warm. In many units, cold-related casualties outnumbered those killed outright in firefights for certain periods. In others, the cold multiplied the lethality of combat. A man who could no longer feel his fingers could not properly operate a weapon. A column that could not keep its radio working could not call for support, leaving units isolated. An outline of bodies in the snow tells two stories simultaneously. It tells of where a firefight took place. It also tells of how the weather compounded a small, tactical misstep into a tragedy. Men were not the only ones who suffered. Horses and dogs that still aided in transport suffered. Food spoiled or froze. The cold made cooking an ordeal. Fuel had to be conserved, but keeping men warm demanded fuel. Commanders weighed choices that in warm weather would be straightforward. They had to decide which roads to keep open, whether to risk a supply truck through a known ambush site, whether to send patrols into weather that could freeze them in their tracks. The question of risk and reward shifted in the cold. In some sectors, commanders chose conservative moves to preserve men, and that conservatism sometimes allowed the enemy to gain ground. In others, boldness that might have worked in milder conditions failed, because the cold tipped the scales. The weather also altered the psychological landscape. Winter squeezes morale. It narrows the visible world to a line of white and black. It makes nights longer, and it makes men miss their families more painfully. Letters that once came with news of warm hearths and roasts seemed remote when a man slept against a frozen gun shield and hoped his feet would not blacken in the morning. The human mind is not designed for months of sustained freezing stress. Sleep is worse in cold. Rest is shallow. Men lose appetite. Men lose hope. Commanders who could offer clear and firm plans, who could maintain rotation schedules to give men brief shelter, who could provide even small comforts, made a disproportionate difference. Small acts, like a hot ration handed out or a blanket found and shared, became enormous morale boosters. Medical data from the period shows an increase in pneumonia, respiratory infections, and other illnesses associated with prolonged exposure to cold. These are things we might call second-order casualties, but they are as real as a bullet. Men who had marched through Europe with good health succumbed to infections after weeks in cold trenches. Those illnesses drain unit strength slowly. A company that goes from 200 able men to 150 through illness and exposure suffers in the same way as a battalion that loses men to direct fire. Replacement men come, sometimes green and inexperienced, and then their inexperience in cold weather makes them more vulnerable still. One of the decisive turns in the campaign was not on the ground, but in the sky. When weather broke, Allied air power returned. The Allies had overwhelming air superiority, and when clouds lifted, fighter and bomber units struck with devastating effect. They attacked German columns that had counted on fog for cover. The result was a rapid degradation of German mobility. Supply points were strafed, fuel trucks burned, and tanks caught in the open were destroyed. The weather that had sheltered the German advance initially became the enemy when it cleared, exposing the long enemy logistic lines to air power. The change in weather did not heal the wounds of frostbite overnight, but it turned a strategic balance. Allied aircraft also aided resupply of encircled units, dropping food, ammunition, and emergency clothing. Those airdrops were not always perfect. Many supplies landed in snowdrifts, some were taken by civilians, and some were destroyed on impact. But they were a lifeline that could not have been delivered by roads when those roads were impassable. Leadership decisions mattered greatly. Some commanders adapted quickly, instituting strict rotation and making sure men had at least minimal shelter in reserve positions. Others held to doctrine unsuited to snow and ice. The U.S. Army did not enter the winter with perfect equipment. Many units had been outfitted for cold, but not for the intensity of an Ardennes winter offensive. The supply chain had been stretched by months of advance. Clothing was present in depots, but getting it to frontline troops in time proved difficult. Men now know that logistics wins wars, and the Ardennes proved that again. The ability to get warm clothing, hot food, and medical supplies to soldiers was as decisive as any tactical move. The cost to morale and to skill cannot be overstated. Frozen fingers meant less marksmanship. Soldiers with trench foot were less mobile. Units with heavy non-battle casualties could not mount counterattacks. In this sense, the cold sometimes functioned as an equalizer, and at times as a decisive factor. The successful American response owed as much to resilience and improvisation as it did to planning. Allied commanders learned to use available shelter, to scour for wood and fuel, to prioritize resupply to units in the most exposed positions, and to stagger attacks away from the coldest hours of the day when possible. There is an important human element in every statistic. Each frozen toe belonged to a man with a name, with a letter at home, with a comrade who carried him in a manner that cannot be counted. The stories that come from the battle are full of those human acts. Men shared last cigarettes, they traded jackets, they wrapped up wounded comrades, and sat awake through freezing nights to listen for rescue. These images matter because they show how ordinary human kindness and raw will shaped outcomes. The cold did not merely pick off numbers. It broke down the ordinary comforts that keep a soldier human, and then tested whether that man would continue to bear arms. When the snow finally began to melt, and roads could be cleared, the ground campaign resumed with the added weight of losses and experiences learned. The German offensive had failed to achieve strategic success. They had used weather to gain an initial advantage, but they could not overcome the lack of fuel and reserves, nor could they sustain their gains once Allied air power returned. The final accounting of the battle includes thousands killed, wounded, and missing. Within those numbers are the men who died from exposure, the men who succumbed to pneumonia, the men who froze in their sleep, and the men whose injuries were compounded by lack of immediate medical care. To suggest that the winter killed more Americans than German bullets is to make a provocative claim. It is true that the winter inflicted casualties that are often underestimated in public memory, and that non-combat injuries and exposure played a huge role in the human cost. It is also true that the enemy, by a long shot, killed and wounded many through direct actions. The correct historical posture is to recognize both facts at once. The weather did not replace enemy fire, it multiplied its effect. It introduced an additional vector of harm that in some units and during certain days may have surpassed combat deaths. A full understanding requires careful counting and nuance. The battle also left lessons for the military beyond the immediate human toll. It forced a re-examination of cold weather doctrine, of equipment design, and of logistics management. Armies learned to prioritize cold weather gear in new ways. Mountain warfare schools adjusted their training. Medical services improved protocols for dealing with frostbite, hypothermia, and trench foot. The U.S. Army, like every army of the era, had relied on rapid movement and mechanization. The Ardennes reminded planners that weather can return a mechanized army to the level of a foot soldier who must hold a small patch of ground with basic tools. The importance of flexible supply lines, of redundancy in fuel stores, and of rapid medical evacuation became clearer. Finally, the human story is one of endurance. It is a story of men who were not prepared for the worst of winter, but who faced it nonetheless, and who, under tremendous stress, found ways to keep going. It is a story of small units holding crossroads, of medics treating frostbite with limited supplies, of sergeants teaching men how to wrap their feet to avoid trench foot, of cooks making scarce hot soup with frozen rations. These acts, small in themselves, combine to form the backbone of the larger effort. Battles are made of big movements and small acts. The Battle of the Bulge, and particularly its brutal December days, shows how both matter. In the end, the Ardennes in December 1944 was an environment that turned warfare into something broader than the clash of opposing forces. It was a harsh instructor that taught hard lessons about planning, about logistics, and about the fragility of human bodies in extreme cold. It is a sobering reminder that a soldier's enemy is not always visible across a field, that sometimes an invisible temperature can equal the threat of a rifle. Memory of that winter should not reduce the role of combat. It should expand our understanding of the full costs of war. A man who froze to death in a shell hole after being wounded by shrapnel died because of both the enemy's force and the weather's indifference. Recognizing that complexity deepens our respect for what soldiers endured, and it honors those who died in all the ways war can deprive a human life. If we measure courage by the ability to keep moving forward, then the men of December 1944 in the Ardennes displayed a considerable kind of courage. They kept marching and standing and fighting, despite the cold at their backs. They adapted. They endured. They improvised fires in craters. They wrapped their toes in old rags. They told small jokes in the dark to keep despair at bay. Their experience is not a simple tally of bullets fired or tanks lost. It is an array of difficulties, of weather and war, of decisions and their consequences. So when historians and storytellers speak of the Ardennes, it is not enough to describe troop movements and firing lines. One must describe the wind that seeped into boots, the trucks that would not start, the radios that would not transmit, and the paratrooper who refused to surrender. You must describe the doctor who dug through frozen mud to tend a frostbitten hand, the cook who risked a patrol to collect wood for a stove, the driver who kept an engine running all night, to save his men from sleeping outside. Those details reveal how winter was a participant in the battle, deadly and neutral, precise and implacable. They show how weather can be as decisive as strategy, and how it can convert small errors into tragedy. The Ardennes winter of 1944 was therefore more than a backdrop. It was a force that shaped the battle in every measurable and unmeasurable way. It added to the death toll, it degraded both sides, it altered command decisions, it humbled plans, and it taught lessons that would save lives later. To forget the winter is to forget a central part of the story. To remember it properly is to hold a fuller account of what those men faced, and to carry the lesson forward. War is not just between humans. It is a contest among men, machines, and the weather, and sometimes the weather wins by doing nothing more than existing.